In the dim rotunda of the prison under the lifeless torchlight, William Lithgow's knees buckled not from fear but from something slower, something deeper. His eyes, ringed with weeks of sleep lost to screaming, traced the cracks in the walls as if looking for God, or at least a way out. But there were no exits. Only stone and heat, and the distant sound of a chain dragging over tiles like a serpent hunting blind. His breath caught when they opened the door. Not the cell door, the one across the corridor. The one that led to the room with no name, where men entered whispering prayers and left in silence or not at all. The guards didn't need to speak. Their boots said everything. The heaviness of finality, the rhythm of ritual. One of them adjusted his grip on the irons. Another held the scroll with the charges, a list written in a language Lithgow couldn't read, for a crime he never confessed, in a court that spoke only punishment. As they dragged him forward, his hands bound and swollen, he no longer begged. That was a week ago. Now he simply waited to be remembered. The myth, like many others shaped by empire and parchment, was gentle in its cruelty. They told it like a fable that William Lithgow was a curious Scottish traveler, a man of letters and faith who wandered too far, spoke too boldly, and found himself caught in a net not meant for him. That he suffered torture in Spain, yes, but that he recovered, returned to England, and wrote a book about it. They called it unfortunate, perhaps tragic, a tale of mistaken identity, a misunderstanding between powers. But myths are made to bury what memory cannot hold. And this one was no different. What they do not tell you, what most histories skip, is that William Lithgow was not simply tortured. He was annihilated, not killed but dismantled, in body, in voice, in belief. They do not tell you that the Inquisition had been watching him long before his arrest, not for a crime, but for what he represented. A Protestant, a writer, a spy perhaps, a symbol definitely, and symbols were dangerous. The lie says he was interrogated, the truth says he was ritually broken. The lie says he was beaten, the truth says he was unmade, piece by piece, in a theater of silence and fire. It was not just an execution delayed, it was a rehearsal of death over and over until his soul forgot what living meant. It was a holy place, they said, where men were purified. But it smelled of blood and burnt cloth. The Inquisition did not ask questions, it asserted absolutes. And Lithgow, with his maps and journals and careful footsteps, had become a heresy that walked. They say he lived. But what walked out of the prison weeks later, if you can call it walking, was a ghost trailing flesh. This was no tale of travel gone wrong. This was a warning written on the body of a man who remembered too much. Before he was bones wrapped in bruises, before his feet were scorched and his voice made hoarse from screaming into stone, William Lithgow was a traveler. But not the kind who sought taverns and songs. His journeys were not for pleasure, nor fame, nor even salvation. He walked the world to witness it, to record it, translate it, draw it into maps and prose, to make sense of it. In an age where men were burned for having opinions, Lithgow carried ink like a weapon and observation like a sin. Born in Lanark, Scotland in the late 16th century, he was no prince, no cleric, no warrior, but he had something rarer, a kind of relentless curiosity sharpened by Protestant zeal and national pride. The Reformation had carved deep scars across Europe, and Lithgow carried those scars like armor. Every mile he walked, every cathedral he sketched, every empire he crossed was marked by the tension between faiths, between languages, between truths. By his 20s, he had walked thousands of miles across France, Italy, Turkey, the Holy Land, and North Africa. He had survived starvation, shipwrecks, and disease. He had witnessed executions in Constantinople, riots in Jerusalem, and plague in Cairo. His writings were sharp, often poetic, and defiantly Protestant. He mocked Catholic processions. He called the Pope the whore of Babylon. He published travelogues that didn't just describe, they judged. And that, ultimately, was his crime. When he arrived in Spain, a land ruled by the shadow of the Inquisition, he did so under the guise of a curious traveler. But in truth, he was more than that. He was a spy. Or at least that's what the Spanish believed. He took notes on fortresses, he counted cannons, he sketched naval formations. To the crown of Spain, locked in war with England, threatened by Protestant revolts, haunted by the ghosts of Luther and Calvin, Lithgow was not a writer. He was a threat. Lisbon in 1620 was a city of masks, merchants, priests, nobles, all watched by unseen eyes. Lithgow wandered through it with the boldness of someone who had survived worse. He dined with English allies. He asked too many questions, and finally he was betrayed. Historians say it was a Scottish merchant who handed him over. Envy, perhaps, or fear, or gold. Whatever the reason, Lithgow was arrested while preparing to leave, his journals confiscated, his sketches burned, and in a cold stone room, under the coat of arms of the Inquisition, he was accused of espionage, heresy, and blasphemy. He was interrogated not for what he had done, but for what he believed. Because in 17th century Spain, belief was enough to brand you unholy. The court was not a trial, it was a theater. His judges wore robes not of law, but of divine authority. The charges read like scripture, but they were soaked in blood. Lithgow, still clutching fragments of his journals, tried to defend himself. He invoked God. He pleaded Protestant innocence. He cited the Geneva Bible. But the chamber was deaf to the language of dissent. To them he was not a man. He was a symbol, a Protestant, a Briton, a wanderer who dared question the orthodoxy of empire. And symbols had to be broken, publicly, painfully, and without exception. He had walked across continents, survived deserts and wars, only to find his undoing not in battle, but in belief. It didn't begin with fire, it never does. It began with isolation, with silence so absolute it swallowed his name. With the slow scraping of metal trays on stone. With walls that leaked cold through every breath. The first days were not violent. They were void, and that, Lithgow would later write, was worse than pain. Because pain was presence. But this was erasure of voice, of memory, of meaning. The room they placed him in was not a cell, but a confession chamber carved into the bowels of the Inquisition's palace in Lisbon. No sunlight reached it. The only illumination came from sputtering tallow candles mounted to the walls like pale fungi. The floor was damp with the smell of mildew and old blood. The air held the weight of hundreds who had passed through ghosts of shattered truths and unmade men. He was kept awake for days. They called it preparation. He was denied food save for mold-soft bread. His water smelled of iron. Every few hours guards would march in, not to beat him, but to whisper strange, disjointed words in Latin, Portuguese, Spanish. Some prayed over him, others mocked him. Some simply stared, but no one explained. He was stripped of his writings, his clothes. Even his name was spoken differently, twisted through Spanish tongues until he barely recognized it. They called him Ligo, Lithgow, the heretic. But Lithgow's undoing was not physical at first, it was spiritual. He wrote years later that it was not the rack nor the branding that broke him, it was the absence of God. The feeling that his prayers hit stone, that the verses he had clung to on every continent were swallowed by this place. That the God he believed in had turned away, or worse, was watching silently. He prayed anyway, and they punished him for it. On the seventh day, they brought in the first instrument, a simple cord. Not to strangle, but to bind. His arms were twisted behind his back, wrists tied so tightly his fingers purpled within minutes. He was hoisted like a carcass, suspended mid-air by his own limbs. Not a whip, not a blade, just tension, sustained, silent, holy pain. And through it all, they asked questions he could not answer. Do you deny the Holy Church? Did you bring messages from the English king? Why did you draw the fort at Balaam? When he refused to confess, they lowered him, fed him, let him sleep, then raised him again. It was a ritual torture, not as punishment but as liturgy, each knot tied with reverence, each scream a psalm. And slowly the man who had walked from Damascus to Naples, who had stood before Turkish pashas and Maltese knights, who had mapped deserts and cathedrals, began to dissolve. Not from guilt, but from the unbearable knowing that he was alone. Continuing with the most harrowing and symbolic section. They did not kill him, not in the way history usually defines death. But William Lithgow died in that room slowly, precisely, and with full ceremony. His death was not an ending, it was a procession. It began with the boots, thick, polished, echoing down the corridor like the toll of a cathedral bell. He could not raise his head anymore. His neck muscles refused. His jaw had not moved in hours. He had lost count of the days. Perhaps it was morning, perhaps night. The light never changed. Only the scent, a coppery stench, fresh and warm, told him someone else had screamed before him. They entered without speaking. The same robed man led them. His face remained calm, not cruel, not kind, only absolute. This was not vengeance, this was ritual. Lithgow, half naked and smeared with old bruises, was dragged to the center of the chamber where a low wooden frame sat, drenched in oil. This was not a rack. This was an altar. They tied him down, but gently, as if strapping down a relic. His arms stretched back, wrists raw, ankles bound so tight the rope cut flesh. Then the heat. He smelled it before he felt it, a thick, rising warmth that filled his lungs with ash and clove. Iron tools lay on a nearby bench, their edges blackened not by fire but by use. And in the corner a brazier crackled not with flame but with embers slow, glowing, alive. The first touch was not to the skin but to the soul. A red-hot rod brought near, not pressed, not yet but held so close the hair on his legs curled. His teeth chattered, not from cold but from memory. He had seen this before, in Morocco, in Smyrna. He had written about it once distantly as a traveler. But here now he was not the witness, he was the right. They began with the feet. To silence a man you do not start with the tongue. You begin with the parts that walked him into sin. The soles were sliced open slowly, without puncture, only enough to peel the first veil of skin. No blood, just air, cold and biting. Then came the iron, not stabbed, not hammered, but kissed against the flesh. A love letter in heat. Lithgow did not scream, not at first. He inhaled. A gasp so sharp it cracked something in his ribs. His back arched, but the ropes held. The second touch came faster, this time on the thigh. Flesh sizzled, the smell undeniable, like meat forgotten on fire. He thought of his mother's hearth in Lanark, of lamb stew, of burnt wood, and vomited. The priest murmured something in Latin. A benediction, perhaps, or a curse. One of the guards crossed himself, another looked away. They turned him. And now came the flaying, not in sheets as legend tells, but in threads. Thin, deliberate lines carved with a hooked blade along his back. Between shoulder blades, along the spine, not deep, but enough that each breath dragged fabric against wound. Enough that sweat felt like acid. Enough that the body began to doubt its own borders, unsure where man ended and pain began. Still no confession. They tried the garrote next, A cord wound around his neck, twisted slowly, not to kill but to remind, a reminder that the air he still took in was theirs, that even breath was not his own. His eyes bulged, blood vessels ruptured, then release, just before unconsciousness. Again and again. He lost control of his limbs. He began to whisper in tongues, sometimes Hebrew, sometimes Latin, sometimes broken Scots. His mind, once sharp and cartographic, had begun to drift. He saw his own body from above, detached, observing, like a map, a drawing, a symbol, nothing more. But symbols they feared most of all. So they branded him, a cross on the chest, a mark of silence. He was no longer a man, he was a message. To every traveler, every Protestant, every mind that wandered too far. When they were finished, and it took days, they carried him back, not like a prisoner, but like a relic too damaged to display. He could not walk, he could not speak, but his heart still beat. And they feared that more than anything. So they released him, not out of mercy, but as a warning. They dressed him in rags and dumped him at the gate of the British consulate. A twitching, stinking monument to their authority. Let him live, they said. Let him remember. And he did. Every breath, every burn. He remembered. But the man they released was not William Lithgow. Not anymore. He had died, burned and bled and broken in that room with no name. What survived was the scream. They say he stumbled through the doors like a shadow given form. A heap of limbs, smoke-stained and shaking, collapsing on the floor of the English consulate in Lisbon. The clerks had seen drunks, they'd seen sailors, plague-stricken pilgrims, even wounded soldiers. But never this. Never him. William Lithgow, who had once walked across continents with a spine made of scripture and maps, now lay curled like a child, eyes unfocused, lips cracked, feet unrecognizable. A doctor was summoned, though it did little good. The wounds were not just of the body. His back bore burns in the shape of iron wheels. His ankles were carved by cords so deep they looked like sculptures. His chest, blistered and black, bore a brand that pulsed with fever. But it was his silence that terrified them most. Days passed before he spoke. When he did, it was not in English, nor in any language they could place. His voice had retreated into the labyrinth of what he had endured. When the British diplomats realized what had happened, they moved quietly. No accusations, no outrage, just paperwork. A letter here, a ship arranged there, an unofficial apology whispered through gritted teeth. Spain had broken a man, but diplomacy demanded calm. England, then in cautious talks with Spain, could not risk war for a traveler who asked too many questions. So Lithgow was exiled again, not by force, but by neglect. They shipped him home, slowly, through pain, through fever. He arrived in England like a relic returned from a failed crusade. His body bandaged, his feet so ruined he could barely stand, his mind haunted by rooms that did not exist on any map. He was received not as a hero, but as a complication. There were no parades, no trial for the men who mutilated him, only ink. Because William Lithgow, despite everything, still had one weapon left. He could write. In the months that followed, as his flesh scarred over and his bones set crooked, he began to dictate, first in fragments, then in full sentences. He described the room, the priests, the blades. He recalled the words they had spoken, the prayers, the rhythm of the garrote as it tightened around his throat. Every memory, every scream poured onto paper. And when it was done, he published it. A true and experimental discourse upon the beginning, proceedings, and victorious event of this last siege of Breda, a title buried in typical 17th century verbosity, but beneath its folds lay truth. Brutal, unnerving, inconvenient truth, of torture, of the Inquisition, of a man reduced to nothing, then forced to live. The Church denied it, Spain mocked it, England quietly shelved it. But readers read, and in candlelit rooms across Europe whispers began, about the room with no name, about the Protestant traveler who lived, about a man who had seen hell and returned not with fire but with ink. He never truly recovered. The body healed in ways the mind could not follow. His walk remained a limp, his voice remained hoarse. But it was his eyes that unnerved people most, eyes that blinked not at pain but at peace, as if calm itself was a lie. He continued writing, continued traveling, though never with the same fire. His books sold modestly. His name floated among literary circles, respected, occasionally referenced, often doubted. Some said he exaggerated, that his descriptions were theatrical, that the Inquisition had no reason to torture a mere traveler, that perhaps he had provoked it. But Lithgow never responded to those claims. He didn't need to. He had already screamed once with enough force to last a lifetime. And so he faded, not into peace but into presence. A man who became a map of pain, whose body bore the borders of empire, whose suffering was inconvenient, impolite, unfashionable. He did not die young, but parts of him never aged beyond that chamber. And in that perhaps the Inquisition succeeded, not in silencing him but in separating him. History remembers wars, kings, revolutions. But what of the man who was almost forgotten? The man who screamed into stone and then wrote it down? William Lithgow was not a general, not a monarch. He built no empire, raised no army, won no crown. He walked, he watched, he wrote, and for that they tried to erase him. But memory, when inked in pain, has a way of surviving. His story does not appear in textbooks. There are no statues in his name, no holidays, no stained glass windows. But in the dark corners of archives, in brittle-page travelogues, in the footnotes of religious histories, he flickers like a candle in a crypt. Not extinguished, just obscured. And perhaps that is his true legacy. Not martyrdom, not sainthood, but evidence of what power fears, of what faith can become when wielded without mercy. The Inquisition wanted silence, not just from him, but from his kind. Wanderers, writers, believers who believed differently. They didn't just break bones, they broke symbols, and in their fire-lit rooms they turned truth into smoke. But Lithgow survived, not because he was strong, but because he remembered. He became a vessel, a map, a body etched with the evidence of what happens when words threaten thrones. His pain was not just personal, it was political. His suffering not random but orchestrated, ritualized, framed by crosses and sanctioned by priests. And that is the horror most forget. Cruelty, when sanctified, becomes tradition. Centuries later, his books gathered dust. But the chamber where he died metaphorically, spiritually echoes still. In every prison cell where dissent is crushed, in every regime that brands belief as treason, in every silence that follows a scream no one wants to hear. He died an old man, but he was buried long before that. Buried beneath diplomacy, beneath national interest, beneath the polite coughs of those who find torture distasteful but not disqualifying. Yet the truth remains. The Inquisition did not kill him because he was dangerous. He became dangerous because they tried to kill him. And so the question lingers not just in history but in us. What do we do with the stories that bleed? What do we do with those who survived but were never truly allowed to return? William Lithgow walks still in the forgotten footnotes, in the airless rooms of state archives, in the whispers between history and myth. He walks in silence. But his scream remains pressed into parchment, soaked into the page. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it. in the hollow between justice and power, in the moment before a door closes, in the shadow of a flag across a crown. He was not a martyr. He was a mirror. And what he shows us is what we chose to forget. The body was gone, but the echo of his scream never left the stone.